Hello, friends. Dan Doriani here. We've been away for a couple months, and apparently we forgot to say that we plan 3 or 4 seasons of our working podcast each year with 6 or 7 episodes each. So we're dropping season 3, 1 episode each Wednesday starting December 1st. And we hope you enjoy visiting with Governor Bill Haslam, Dan Allender, Steph Hubach, Scott Sauls, and more.
Let's think about having a conversation about the theology of our politics. And it matters too much for us to not be talking about how we should act. You know, how should we then live, to borrow a phrase, in the political world, given the things that Jesus has told us?
Bill Haslam was a very successful businessman when people began to approach him and ask him to go into politics. He became mayor of his city, Knoxville, Tennessee, and then shortly thereafter became the governor of Tennessee for 2 terms. He was extraordinarily popular and built consensus on all kinds of issues. He is one of the most thoughtful people I've ever encountered on the topic of faith and work, especially in the public realm, in the realm of governance. Bill Haslam is a man who succeeded at his work, and yet he's found his way to humility. And that humility shows even as he shares his wisdom with us today. I'm convinced you're going to like what he has to say. From the Center for Faith and Work here in St. Louis, this is Working with me, your host, Dan Doriani. Here we strive to fire the imagination of Christians who long to practice their faith in the workplace. Through conversations with doctors, athletes, teachers, executives, and more, we seek to engage those who desire to do significant work, to practice love and justice in their work, and who dare to change their corner of the world through that work. My guest today is Governor Bill Haslam. I should say perhaps former governor. He finished in a couple years ago, which is why we're able to get him today. An extremely successful mayor of Knoxville, and then he became the governor of Tennessee in 2011, elected in 2010. The thing that impresses me most about his resume is that he won his 2nd term with the biggest margin of victory in the history of Tennessee gubernatorial races, which means he won a lot of people over who wanted him to be governor the 2nd time. And he's a man of deep faith who wants to practice his faith at work. And he's written a book about that called Faithful Presence. And Governor Haslam, we are delighted to have you here today.
Well, thanks. We share several mutual friends, so I'm glad to meet you, even if it is via Zoom and in an interview.
Yeah, and we'll hope that someday we can meet in person. That would be a delight. So I want to just start talking almost right away about your call to politics. What made you think you were a businessman, and you are a businessman, and then something moved you to come to the conviction that maybe God was calling you into politics, that you could serve your state, serve your people in a different way. How is it that you came to be involved in politics?
Yeah, so let me start with politics is a lot more bearable and manageable if you truly feel like you were called to be there.
Yes.
Without it, it can get a little hairy.
Yes.
But so I did. So I was kind of minding my own business, a business person in my early 40s in Knoxville, and some people came to me and said, "Hey, why don't you think about running for mayor?" And I truly laughed. I'm like, "You so got the wrong guy." And they said, "Well, think and pray about it." And it's kind of hard to tell people you won't even do that.
Right.
And then I brought it up to my wife, who I was sure would say, "No way."
Right.
And she said, "Hey, I think you should, let's pray about that." And then had a group of guys that I'd met with for literally every Friday morning for 20 plus years, and brought it up to them thinking they would say the same thing. And they said, "You should maybe think about that." And ironically, that was about 20 years ago. Right now, 9/11 had just happened, and kind of the importance of government and what happens in it was kind of re-impressed on me. And I think typically in my life, God tends to work and move me through numerous things. Maybe I'm just so stubborn it takes several things, but it was a combination of all that. And then a friend who was teaching a series on Jeremiah at the time, and that point in Jeremiah 29 when the Israelites are being held captive in Babylon, and Jeremiah writes to them, and I always say, hey, if I'm ever held captive, write and say, "We're coming to get you." But Jeremiah writes and says, "Get used to it. You're going to be there a while."
Right.
And then he says, "Plant gardens, build houses, have your children marry, have them have children, And then in 29:7 says, seek the welfare of the place where you have been called.
Right.
For in its welfare, you will find your welfare, which
Right.
sounds nice and sweet until you realize that they're in Babylon.
Right.
And, they've got a horrible king over them. They're slaves. And he's telling them, seek the welfare of the place where you've been called. And that verse just kind of jumped out to me as like this is a great way to do that. And I thought that then, and now that I've been in office, for 4 different terms as mayor and governor, I think it even more in terms of a wonderful way to serve the people around you is to be in public office.
And we would probably agree that a lot of the skills you acquired in business or the values you acquired in business transferred to government. One other thing that jumped out at me is that you managed to have both tax cuts and infrastructure growth and a balanced budget and state savings. And if I can just get into policy for 1 second, you also became the first state to offer 2 years of education, community college or technical college for free. And, I love balanced budgets. But I really want to go over toward free education after high school. That's ordinarily considered a Democratic matter, a Democratic policy, by which we mean Democratic Party, not people who believe in democracy.
Right.
And one of the things that Scott Sauls, our mutual friend, said, he was occasionally charged with being a rhino, Republican in name only. And I thought, man, I like him more. I mean, he must not be too doctrinaire. He pursues what he thinks is right, even if it's not technically aligned traditionally with Republican values. Why did you go for that? And how did that happen?
Like a whole lot of people in our country, my father was a first-generation college student.
Yes.
He only got to go to college because he got a football scholarship, to be honest. And I saw how it changed the trajectory of his life. And while the free community college is traditionally thought of as a Democratic idea, I would argue that as Republicans, we should be concerned about creating opportunity. The idea, I think, is how do we make certain that more people don't need government help later in life? That I would say that'd be a staple of what Republicans believe. And so one of the ways we do that is we shrink the opportunity gap that is education. And I just firmly believe that great public education is foundational if we're going to be who we want to be.
Yeah.
But the reality is a lot of people either can't afford it or don't know that they can afford it.
Right.
Because nobody in their family's ever been there. So the last thing I'd say is really for purely practical reasons. In the old world, when states went to recruit businesses, it was all about how much incentive you'll give or what the piece of property looks like. Today, it's about, do you have a workforce that's trained to meet our needs?
Right.
And that means typically post-secondary training of some type. So part of it was the purely selfish reason of making certain we could tell businesses, we have the workers you need.
That's terrific. And I think we both agree that, values that are traditionally called Republican or Democratic actually kind of fit in the other party a lot of times. So my favorite on that is protecting the unborn. I think the Democrats should all be in favor of that because they're in favor of protecting the poor and the weak. Who's weaker than an unborn child?
Who's more vulnerable, right?
Who's more vulnerable, exactly. But then equal opportunity is such a Republican value traditionally, and yet we don't see the connection to offering people the education allows them to thrive. So I'm thrilled that you not only wanted to do that, but you accomplished it.
Yeah, thanks.
So the first 20 pages of your book, which is called Faithful Presence, a wonderful, very accessible book about Christians and politics, spends a lot of time lamenting the nature of discourse in our country today, the way, all Democrats are socialists and all Republicans are racists and everybody's evil, and the loss of respect and civility. Can you are a civil guy and you manage to work with all kinds of people. Give us a summary of what you think we need to restore civil discourse.
So I wrote the book not just for Christians in politics, but for all of us. How should we look at the public square? Because part of the argument that I want to make is, as Christians, we learn theology about a lot of things, about what's a theology of marriage, what's a theology of raising children, what's a theology even of running a business. We don't talk much about theology of politics. we talk about, well, here's the maybe the Christian position on marriage or on the unborn, but we don't really talk about what should we act like, in the same way that we teach our high school students in youth ministries. Here's what it looks like to be a high school student following Jesus. And so what I really want to do is to say, as Christians, as the world has changed, we've reacted out of fear. And we said, oh my, the culture is changing. Look what's happening all around us. But reacting out of fear is never a good thing. And so we've become just like everyone else. We're just as likely to be nasty on the internet. Yeah. We're just as likely to believe some conspiracy theory that is not grounded in fact at all. When we're supposed to be the one that's keeping this degradation of culture happening. If Jesus says in Matthew 5, hey, if the salt is lost its saltiness, it's good for nothing except to be thrown out and trampled underfoot. And the salt's job is to keep the meat good. It's not the meat doesn't blame, or the salt doesn't blame the meat when the meat goes bad. The meat blames the salt. And so we should start with ourselves when we look at the culture going bad and say, what have we done that has helped, this, again, the deterioration of culture that all of us see and feel?
Yeah, that's terrific. And so I'm a blogger, and what I've noticed in watching secular and Christian blogs is that the reactions to the things I write, I don't check often because it's just so depressing. They're
right.
The anger is almost identical. They just don't take God's name in vain, and they don't use 4-letter words. But the Christians sound almost exactly the same as somebody writing into Wall Street Journal or New York Times or something. It's really sad.
Well, and that was one of my experiences from being in office, is the things that we heard from Christians sounded no different than those from non-believers. Yeah. And that was, really sad and disappointing to me. So part of the reason, again, I wrote the book was, how do we act in a different way so that we really are salt and light in the public square?
Yeah, and so one of the things I really loved in your book, I enjoyed many things in the book, but one thing I really loved was your story about the value. It's predicated on the value of listening to the other person. But on pages 24 and 25, you tell the story of some negotiations with the civil service union in Tennessee, and you wanted to move the state away from longevity-based promotions to virtue or skill or performance-based, and it went really easily, and everybody agreed. And then there was an interview at the end, and they wanted fireworks. They wanted to hear about the fireworks, and there weren't any. So would you just tell us about that and why you think the character and listening are so important?
I think part of my lesson there is to realize that where we get our news from, it's built on a market of outrage.
Yes.
And the cable news networks that literally their business model is outrage. And so if I can get you mad enough, you'll keep watching and you'll tune in again tomorrow and to confirm that what you thought was right when you hear me tell again that what you think is right.
Yes.
And that became readily apparent to me in the example you talked about. We had changed. Most governments have a civil service system, which is put in place for good reason, so that people wouldn't just, good old boy network and hire their friends and their uncles and their nephews. But instead, there'd be a process. But the problem is it's turned out to reward longevity instead of merit. And again, if we go back to what's government's to provide great service, and you can't provide great service if you're hiring people based on who's been waiting in line the longest.
Right.
So we changed that at about that time. This is 2011. That's right when the politics of the country kind of were exploding and people were, protesting at state houses across the country. And so Fox had heard we had made the change. And so they called, said, hey, would you come on the news, explain what you did? They were assuming that we had, beat down the government employees union and had a big
You'd won a
battle.
mighty contest.
Right. And that people were protesting, at the state house. And when I said, well, that's actually not what happened, and said, the head of the Employees Association was actually there for the bill signing. And it kind of got quiet on the other end. And they said, well, thanks so much for being on tonight. And, ended the interview, because if there wasn't going to be fireworks, there could be no outrage. And there wasn't a lot of interest.
So it was about a 1-minute interview, 2-minute interview?
To me, I'm sure it was one of the shortest interviews of all time of cable TV.
Yeah. Yeah, because it didn't create any outrage. But I want to go. So that's good. I'm really glad to hear that. How did it come to pass that you changed the rules for the union? It's not always easy to do. And you stress listening in your book. So how much listening why is listening carefully and patiently so important?
Well, it really starts with this. And, I'm one of those that believes all truth is God's truth, okay?
Yes.
And the Romans 3:23, all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God, is true of all of us.
Right.
And I know if it's true of me and I fall short all the time, it also means that my political argument might not be exactly right.
Mm-hmm.
If I've been wrong about 117 things today, and that's probably a low number, if I've made that many mistakes, then I could have made some mistakes. I developed what I think about some issue.
Right.
And so if that's true, then it's really important, I would argue, for biblical reasons, to listen to the other side, because I know I'm not perfect, number one. Number two, I know the person on the other side of the issue is created in the image of God. And the final thing would be this: if my object really is to get to the right answer, if that's my object, then I need to not be so insistent that my answer is where we're going to end up.
Right. So one of my friends, who's a very, very good leader, says, I present my ideas to as many people as I can so they knock the nonsense out of them.
Yeah.
Or knock the silliness out of them.
Yeah. I love that.
Because who's going to nail it the first time you start to make a policy proposal? It's almost impossible to imagine.
Just doesn't happen.
Yeah. So connected to that, you also stress faithful presence. That's the title of the book. Can you tell us what faithful presence means? And I'll just say this. I think you and I agree that it's not simply showing up. We're showing up on time, and we're talking about politics, but faithful presence, let's say you're on an assembly line or, something of that nature, it's not simply showing up. There's more to it than just being there. What's faithful presence? I
used to say I stole, but then my wife reminded me that I actually asked him if I could borrow it, the title from James Davison Hunter, who's a sociology professor at the University of Virginia. And because I thought it perfectly encapsulated, really, if you think about believers in the public square, we have one of two reactions, that neither of which is appropriate. One is just to not be present, to say, a pox on both of their houses. I'm frustrated, I'm exhausted, none of this stuff is eternal. I'm checking out to go focus on
evangelism or my kids or the football team, whatever it is.
Right, yep. Exactly. Because this is not, none of this is of God. And to them, one of the quotes that I have in the book, I'm going to mess it up because I should memorize it, but I don't have it. But Luther basically says, send your very best into politics. He said, in preaching, the Holy Spirit does all the work. Yes. But in politics, it's so ambiguous and it's so messy that you need people who really have the ability to discern right from wrong. And so I would argue that the believers who just say, I don't want anything to do with that, I'm going to worry about things that I think are eternal, are missing it. The other problem, I think, is believers who are too into the public square, and they basically have based all their hopes and fears on whether their candidate gets elected. And I would argue that's not a very faithful approach either. And so this idea of what would it look like to walk out my faith in the public square in a way that honors Christ? And I just don't think we've thought that much about that issue.
Yeah, that's great. I love that corrective of two mistakes. If my candidate wins, God wins. And I should stay away from this entirely. And you and I both agree that the Bible's full of people like Ezra, Nehemiah, Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego to a lesser degree.
Keep going, yeah.
But the one, my favorite, is actually a guy named Obadiah that people forget about, who was the manager of the household of King Ahab, who was probably the worst king Israel ever had.
Yeah.
And he said, when he met Elijah, he's like, hey, I'm a servant of the Lord just like you are. And Elijah didn't say, what are you doing in Ahab's house? He said, you serve the Lord, I serve the Lord. Let's have a conversation. Here's what God's going to do. I want to tell you what's going on. How on earth can you work for Ahab and Jezebel? But he did. Yeah. God called Obadiah to that.
Great example. Great example.
There's another story you tell that I want to go to about a woman named Centolia. And you said that was possibly your toughest decision. At least it was the most controversial decision you ever made as governor.
Yeah, it was probably the most visible decision because of what happened. A quick kind of rehash of the story for your listeners. Centolia Brown was a woman that at the age of 16 ended up on the streets selling, working as a prostitute. And, no 16-year-old girl truly chooses to do that. It had a troubled life in and out of state institutions, et cetera. Shoots in her own words, creates a horrific crime of shooting a man who's picked her up to take her to his home, and killing him. And as a juvenile, she's sentenced to life in prison, which is going to be, at least the way the law works, 72 years. There's a lot of extenuating, like I said, I won't go into the whole story, it'd take the whole podcast to do that. But somebody did a documentary of her called Me Facing Life, the Centolia Brown story. And it picked up and got national attention. So Snoop Dogg and LeBron James and, Rihanna, and you go on and on.
The big names.
So the people who, if we added, my followers and your followers together on Facebook or Instagram or whatever, and multiplied them times 1,000, we wouldn't be there. Okay.
Right.
And so they kind of said, hey, this isn't right. And they start bombarding our office, and it literally becomes a national story. It's on national news, Centolia's case. And this is near the end of my time. I'm literally got, 3 or 4 months to go.
So just to make it clear, just background, so you can commute her sentence.
Thanks.
You have that power, but you have to be very judicious about the way we do that. And it's usually saved till the very end of somebody's term. And you couldn't do that because it was a national story.
Yeah. So thank you. Great, Ed. The governor doesn't have nearly as much power as people think that he or she does, except in this case. You can really, if the governor wants to say, I want to empty the prisons tonight at midnight, unless he or she's being paid to do that, the governor can do that. So the power to commute sentences, pardon, exonerate, is almost, total. So that is in my control. We look into this, and we want to do a couple things. We want to make certain that we're not doing anything for her that's different than everyone else because it's gotten all this attention.
You're right.
We also don't want to not do anything because it's gotten all this attention.
Right.
And so we dig in, and again, long story, but the outcome was, this is her story. Actually, is one that's a picture of a redeemed life. A local Christian college had set up a university and prison program. She had graduated, gotten a 4.0. She truly, from everybody, like I said, our mutual friend Scott Sauls had gotten to know her, and others had. This is truly a picture of a redeemed life. And if she had committed the same crime today, she would serve 15 years, not 72 years. Right. So, we had to make that decision. What's the right thing to do? And in the process, we found there were lots of other people who had committed crimes as juveniles, had gotten life sentences. They just hadn't gotten all the national attention.
And so you paid attention to them too.
We tried to, but the problem, again, a lot of times policies are practical. Yes. And we were running out of time. By this point in time, there's weeks left in my time in office. We didn't have the time to do due diligence on 70 stories. So we thought, we will deal with this. We pardoned some other folks, but in terms of this case, we would deal with it the best we could, knowing what we knew, and decided to pardon her. That was December, and August would be 15 years that she had served. So we commuted it to 15 years. And after we left office, but before she got out of prison, my wife and I, then normal, just citizens, went to the prison to visit her. And God is always in all of our lives weaving this tapestry together. You just don't always get to see the other side of what's happening. Yes. But here's a woman who had been obviously praying that we would decide to set her free. We had been praying about doing the right thing. Our backgrounds couldn't have been more dissimilar. Biracial child who had been adopted in and out of prison institutions. Low income. I was from a white upper class, great education, very privileged background, but truly sitting there that in prison, talking to her, the reality of Galatians 3 of, there's neither Jew nor Gentile, male nor female, slave, nor, slave nor free. It's like, we're brothers and sisters that God had brought our story together, and he was kind of letting us see the other side of the curtain for a little while.
Yeah. It's a great story, and of course it's told in fullness in the book. So what you had to do essentially was try to keep two basic biblical values together, justice and mercy, because you can't just let people loose. I mean, she did kill somebody in a cold-blooded kind of gruesome way.
Right.
And yet, of course, she was at that 15-year mark, which is what she would have been sentenced to. But you also want to have mercy in a case like that. It just strikes me that in politics, it's often, is it not a balance? I hate the word balance, but you've got to keep creative tension between justice and love, justice and mercy, because, mercy to one person is often injustice to another person, right? I mean, business world, if I say I'm going to be merciful to somebody who's underperforming, that's great. That's very kind of me. But I'm also being unjust to the people who have to do the job that man or woman is not doing. It is not easy to put justice and mercy together. And I'm guessing you have to work at that all the time in politics as well as business.
You do. I mean, so 2 points I'd make. The Micah 6:8 verse of act justly, love mercy, walk humbly. I think whatever we're doing, it's all three of those, right? Any two without the third, and you have problem. I mean, if you have justice, but not and humility, but not mercy, you're going to end up being a Pharisees.
You could be
very
cruel.
Humble, but,
I mean,
there you go. Okay,
I mean, parents who are just but not merciful are harsh and demanding, and they're brutal.
So that would be the first thing, is that's kind of what we're called to do. The second thing is, I realized being in office, and particularly having that power to pardon, how hard it is to be just and merciful at the same time.
Yeah.
How hard it is. We all know how hard, if we're supposed to speak the truth with love, it's hard to do both at the same time, right? But here's the place again where I think being a believer just has its practical advantages. We actually have a picture of justice and mercy at the same time in the cross.
We sure do.
And, nobody else really has that picture. And so I frequently came back to thinking, okay, justice and mercy both came, intertwined down on the cross. What's that look like for this decision in front of me right now?
Yeah, that's a very good point. And so, one of the most interesting things is the chapter in which you actually declare that it's not so hard to be a Christian in politics. And I wanted to ask you about that, but now that I'm listening to you, I think I understand it. It's, you have humility that makes you listen, right? Do justice, love mercy, walk humbly with your God. Walk means keep it up. Don't just do it temporarily. If you're merciful for 10 minutes and then you become a tyrant, you're a tyrant, right? So we want to walk. We're just, we're merciful. We're speaking the truth in love. We're humble, so we listen to other people. And I'm beginning to see why you would say that, because you have sort of anchoring principles that guide you.
Right.
But I'm guessing there's more to it than that. To say, I'm amazed, it's not so hard to be a Christian in politics. I'm delighted to hear it. Is that really true, though, Bill?
I think it is, but here's what's hard. It's not hard for the reasons people think. Like, it must be hard because it's such a, dirty, muddy business. Right. It must be hard because people are saying mean things about you, et cetera. No, here's what's hard about being a Christian politics is just like being a Christian professor or a baker or doctor or nurse or whatever you want to say. Is in politics, when it's when it says be anxious for nothing, okay, that's hard.
Yes,
that's hard. When you have a visible position, that's really hard.
Yes.
When it says do nothing from selfishness or empty conceit, but with humility consider others greater than yourselves. Okay, tell me how to do that in politics.
Right.
Right. when you're part of running for office is saying, I'm the man or I'm the woman.
Right, right. How can you be humble while saying, vote for me, I'm the best?
Yeah. And then, and consider others greater than yourself. You're saying, no, I'm the guy, not him or her.
Right, right.
So those are the things. It's the scriptural admonitions about how we're supposed to act that make it hard. But I'd say that same thing's true if you're a professor or a pro baseball player.
Yeah. Well, being a pro baseball player when you're in a slump, I guarantee you that. So let me just make one comment about, I want to follow up on that in two ways. First, what I hear you saying implicitly is when you want to make a good decision, you want to love people and be just. Every yes is a no. To say yes to one policy is to lose something on the other side, and you want to serve your people as best you can, but no particular bill or decision is going to be equally advantageous to everybody. Fair enough?
That's right. And think about the process of setting a budget for a state.
Yes.
Okay, just like when you set one for your family, and there's certain things you say, I would love to do that, but we just can't.
Right.
We can't go on that vacation, buy that, whatever it is.
Yes.
Now you're doing that for a state, and all of a sudden you realize, like my early years, we were just coming out of the recession. The state's budgets were incredibly tight, and there were programs that I knew were good programs, but I knew we couldn't pay for it.
Right.
And like I said, I'm a big believer in, government should only buy what they can pay for. We should balance the budget. And so you talk about difficult to have some program that a family is needing, and you say, we're no longer going to do that.
Right.
That's hard stuff.
It is hard stuff. And yet it's essential. One of the things that I teach when I talk about government in an ethics class is that deficit spending is actually akin to generational theft. I mean, I look at our federal budget and I think, I'm dumping this, not I personally, but we're dumping this on our grandchildren. Our grandchildren are paying for stuff that we bought. That is so backwards.
I couldn't agree more. And and I think the last number I saw, the Congressional Budget Office said that in 2050, like 50% of the budget at the current rate is going to go to interest.
Service.
Okay,
Yeah,
that just doesn't work, right?
Yeah, it doesn't work. That's exactly right. So I thank you I wish I lived in Tennessee, although we do pretty well on balancing the budget in Missouri, I have to say.
Y'all are okay there too, yeah.
Yeah, that's terrific. So the yes and the no, is it hard to be a Christian? I got to just follow up a tiny bit. Maybe it's not hard for you to bear criticism. You said, people say terrible things, but sometimes our spouses and our children bear it more heavily. You knew what you were getting into, number one. And besides, when you have a problem, you could just work at it. Like, I'm going to turn that anger that people are directing toward me, I'm going to prove them wrong. I'm going to solve their problem, et cetera. And that may be false. We can't silence every critic. But our spouse, our kids can't work on it. Is it not harder on them when dad is brutalized?
You nailed it. There is zero question. I mean, it's really hard to see somebody you care about, get shot at. And
right.
I compare it to being the mother of the pitcher on the baseball team or the
right.
softball team. It's like, you're every strike and ball and hit,
yes.
you're kind of you're rejoicing or dying a little bit.
Right.
There's no question. It's way hard. Like I said, at the end of the day, like I said, if you're in the middle of it, you're the one in the middle of it, and
right.
you're not thinking about the bullet that just got shot at you. You're trying to figure out how do we
right.
get to a better place?
Right,
how do we get to a better hill here?
Yeah, exactly. You can channel your energy is the way I found it when I've been in leadership positions. People are mad at me. I go, okay, this problem is not impossible to solve. We're in the middle of it. We can get somewhere. I mean, I was in charge of I was the lead pastor of a large church for a number of years. And it's not the same as being a governor, but there are a lot of opinions.
It's actually remarkable. I tell all my friends who are pastors, being in public office is remarkably similar to being a pastor because A, it's about serving. B,
right.
it's about, if you're in business, it's really clear kind of,
right.
here's what the mission is. We're trying to manufacture more potato chips or sell more widgets or whatever it is.
At a profit, right?
Right. In government, it's, everybody wants a little something different. And there's
right.
folks in church who, obviously, hopefully, that church is all about the mission of knowing Christ and making Christ known. But
right.
the tactics of that could look real
right.
different. So you had some people saying, we're not spending nearly enough on our junior high ministry. And others
right.
are saying, we used to have a great world missions program.
Right.
What happened? And, all of it's good stuff.
Everybody has input.
But you're saying
everybody has input
everybody
in
has-
church and politics and in business. Like if you don't
Right.
necessarily get input. You may, but your input
Yep.
may be, I don't like it. And the boss says, well, if you don't like it, either you can get along with the program or you can find another job. We love you, but if you can't stand it, go elsewhere.
But
You can't
I think
say
the
that
other
to
thing
the
is
people of Tennessee.
yeah, or your church, like, hey,
Right.
it's I think the other thing is oftentimes when you're deciding about things, you're deciding between multiple good things.
Good, and good.
Like,
right.
put more money into the worship program or put more
Right.
money into missions. There's not neither of those is a bad idea, right? And it's like same thing. You want to pay teachers more, or do you want to build more parks? Those aren't
Right.
neither of those are
They're
bad
all good.
ideas.
Yeah, that's true.
But you gotta do what you can pay for.
I want to go back to your big idea of faithful presence for a minute, and then we'll go to my lightning round questions, which maybe they're coming. But I want to ask one more big policy-ish question, and that is faithful presence. You say in one place is the position between withdrawal and assimilation. What does that mean? I love it. I think it's if it's not a quote, it's awfully close to a quote. We need to stand between withdrawal and assimilation. What does that mean, and how do we do it?
So again, withdrawal is that, hey, this is all too messy for me. I'm out of here. And I'm, a pox on both of you. Assimilation is becoming just like everyone else.
Yes.
And neither of those are biblical answers. Again, I'll go back to Jeremiah. It was, hey, seek the welfare of the place you're called. Now, he did not tell them, I want you to become just like the Babylonians. Mm-hmm. The people of Israel were to be distinct. And at one point, it's for that time when they would be called back to Israel. But that's our call. Like, don't be like everybody else. Don't be just as likely to believe a conspiracy theory. Don't be just as likely to blast somebody on the hiding behind the anonymity of the internet. On the other hand, the decisions that are made in government are too, I think, important and too good of a way to serve the people around us just to abandon the playing field.
Yeah, that's good. Right. And can I just add another thing we don't want to do is make negative guesses about people's motives. The reason why they're saying that is really because, and I think that's what Jesus forbids, I think, when he says, don't judge not lest you be judged. We can't read what people's motives are, and we certainly shouldn't constantly read them negatively. Yeah,
and just one thing, and again, I go into this in more detail in the book, but there's something called motivation, attribution, asymmetry. How much we think that not just are you wrong, but you're wrong for bad motives.
Yes,
and
exactly.
To put it in context, 5 years ago in this country, and it's undoubtedly gotten worse, the motivation, attribution, asymmetry between Republicans and Democrats was greater than that between Israelis and Palestinians. Okay, so
that's so important. I want you to say that again.
Yeah,
say that again.
Motivation, attribution, asymmetry. It's a technical term that I've read the study. The information's all in the book, but it's basically how much I not just think you're wrong, but I think you're doing it for bad motives. It's great. That is greater today in the United States between Republicans and Democrats. Actually, it was 5 years ago than it is between Israelis and Palestinians.
That's just astonishing. And I don't even know what to say. We'll just leave it there and we'll meditate on it and ask the question, what can you and I do with it? I want to go to lightning questions, but before I do, is there one more thing you want to say that I didn't ask you? You want to talk about something? You want to make a point?
No, I think, again, given my encouragement given to the listeners of given who your audience is, et cetera, is let's think about having a conversation about the theology of our politics. Mm-hmm. And it matters too much for us to not be talking about how we should act. Yeah. How should we then live, to borrow a phrase, in the political world, given the things that Jesus has told us? And the last thing I'd say is, James, when he's talking about wisdom, he says, he talks about wisdom that's of the earth and then wisdom that's from above.
Right.
He says the wisdom that's from above is pure, peaceable, gentle, open to reason, full of mercy and good fruits.
Yes.
Now, if I said, what do Christians act like in the public square?
Right.
And you and I went down to a shopping mall in St. Louis, I don't think people would say pure, peaceable, gentle, open to reason, full of mercy and good fruits. And yet, I think that's how we're called to act.
And open to reason is not just in James. I mean, open to reason is actually, it's almost totally ignored, and it's several times in the Bible.
Yes.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And it is, I agree with you completely. It's a fruit of humility. And to be straight, to be theological, God knows all things and we don't. And it's just, it's a practical outworking of our deepest theological convictions that we're not the same as God. And God knows all things. We hope to learn more things. And you're making that very concrete in your approach to things. All right, so lightning round, you ready?
I'm ready.
All right, so question number 1. What is your rarest skill? Oh, you can't go more than a minute on any of these. This is okay. I'm going to cut you off if you go long. Okay, what is your rarest skill as a politician?
That's hard. That's a hard thing to answer about yourself, right? Yeah. But I hope it's, and one of the things that I learned, I think it's what believers should do. But by the way, I've also learned it's a pretty good political trait is to listen.
Yep.
People are so surprised when you're running for office and you actually listen to them.
Instead of waiting to make your next point. Mm-hmm.
Yes. I hope that it is listening. I'll put it that way.
Okay, that's terrific. I like that answer. If you had 45 seconds on an elevator, you're going from the 4th floor to the 22nd floor with a young, promising politician, what would you tell him? Other than listen, something else.
Yeah, I would tell him this stuff really matters. The chance to leverage what you do for good is as great in public service as almost anything I know. I'd tell him to wear your own clothes, be yourself. When you try to be what the political campaign consultants tell you to do, it doesn't end well. And I would, assuming this person is a believer, I'd say, trust your call. That if you feel like this is where God has called you to, then you have to trust him in this and act like he's called you to act.
I take notes while people speak in this interview, and I just wrote, this man is called. I'm speaking of you. Your answers, in fact, your previous answer, it matters, be yourself. I wrote down, Bill is called to politics. Yeah. You sound like a man is called. Which is a beautiful thing. We know that, and it makes the work much lighter. What is an unusual or hidden aspect of your work, something no one would guess?
I think the thing that I try to tell people about the way to look at elected officials is this stuff's really hard. It's way harder than it looks at home or on TV shows. And you sit there at home and go, how could the president possibly have decided that? Or how could the governor or the mayor, or whoever, do that? I would say to begin with grace. I take the case of COVID, right? COVID has gotten us all at each other's throats. And why is he doing this about masks or not doing that? Whatever it is. We've all learned a little humility, including the world's best scientists. This thing isn't what we thought it would be.
Right.
And so start with humility and give some grace. That still demand great outcomes. I'm not saying we don't do that, but we give some grace, realizing this is all way harder than it looks.
Yeah, and so many decisions have to be made without the evidence that we want or the information we want, and which is certainly the case with COVID. When it first came out, we didn't know how it was transmitted, how dangerous it was, how to treat it best. So that's an excellent point. I agree with you violently, if I may say so. All right, more quick questions. Other than the Bible, what's a book that influenced you more than any other?
John Stott's book on the Sermon on the Mount is kind of an adaptation of Martin Lloyd-Jones's famous longer book, but it was, I'm sure it has a different title now, but at the time it was called Christian Counterculture,
right?
The Sermon on the Mount. Philip Yancey, What's So Amazing About Grace, 15, 20 years ago was a game changer for me. And then a novel I always point to people to is Cry the Beloved Country.
Oh, yes.
And again, just a picture of grace and pain and sin. And I think it's one of the most Christian novels there are there is, I guess.
Well, we won't question your grammar.
Whether the author intended it that way or not.
By the way, Christian novel, I'm just going to say it. I had a novelist, I had a English lit prof very recently, and Gilead. Do you know Gilead?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, that's a great one also. But I can't quarrel with your three choices. I've read all three, and they're all Terrific. Okay, if you have 2 or 3 free hours, what do you do? What's your hobby? What's your pastime that you really enjoy?
That's such a great question. If I had 2 or 3 free hours, I'd use one of them exercising. I love to run, ride bicycles, etc. Yep. I'd use one of those reading, hopefully outside somewhere. I'd be sitting by the water reading, and I'd use the other one with my wife. We have 10 grandkids, and being a grandparent is about as fun as it gets. So I'd exercise, I'd read, and I'd go with my wife to play with grandkids.
I got a comment. So first of all, exercise makes hard work so much easier, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. It's so much better when your body's in ready to go, and you could sleep at night and all that. So here's a question. Do you know why grandchildren and grandparents like each other so much?
Why is that?
Because they have a common enemy.
Yeah, that's right. There's some truth there.
There's a little bit of truth. Obviously, you and I both have fantastic children and fantastic grandchildren, but
we do.
Thought I'd share that with you. Okay, putting practical considerations aside, don't think about anything. What would you do for a year? If you had a year, not 3 hours, you had a year, what would you do?
Again, practical considerations aside, I would hope that somebody that I really like and admire is the President of the United States, and I go help them do their job.
Ooh, that's a good, I love that one. I hope that the next president, that was not meant as a negative toward our current president at all, but I hope that our next president would have values that are so close to yours that he would say, man, I got to get Bill. I would feel happy about that. Bill, I'm deeply grateful for your service to the state of Tennessee. I'm deeply grateful for this book that you wrote, which has an uncommon amount of godly wisdom. I also want to say that you tied, in my opinion, for the most Bible quotations in any series. And you know who you're tied with? Another politician, Jim Talent, who was... I don't know if you know him or not. You might know him at least a little bit.
I know who he is. I don't know him, but I know who he is.
Oh, man, he knows the Bible like better than most pastors. I'm going to say that. I've had the privilege of being his friend for a long time, but he was a U.S. senator, representative, and all kinds of other roles in government.
Yeah.
So thank you for your time. Maybe thank your wife for giving up a little more of your time, and thank you for ministering to the people who listen to this podcast.
I love it. Thanks for letting me be on. I had a good time. Thanks so much.
Working with Dan Doriani is a production of the Center for Faith and Work St. Louis. We seek to promote faithfulness in the workplace, in education, in discipleship, and in the stories of believers who've applied their faith at work. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please subscribe and rate us on your preferred podcast platform. You can visit our website at faithandworkstl.org. There you can subscribe to our podcast, sign up for our newsletter, learn more about Faith and Work cohorts, leave us a message, and more. You can also follow us on Facebook and Instagram at Faith and Work STL, and find the video version of this show on our YouTube channel. All these links are available in the podcast show notes and on our website. Thanks for listening.